and esotericism. And we're continuing our 2020 program and the conference focusing on the theme of the mystery of consciousness. Now, obviously, due to COVID-19, the conference is organized online, but the good news is that, like all the best things in life, it's free, and it's every Sunday as well. Also, Edward Abdil will be lecturing once a month on Wednesdays, and the next one will be on the 25th. But today we have the great honor and privilege of welcoming as our guest speaker, Professor P. Krishna, who will be speaking on consciousness from a scientific and a religious standpoint. Now, Professor Krishna is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation in India, staying at the Rajghat Education Center in Varanasi. He was the rector of the center and principal of the Rajghat Besant School from 1986 to 2002. As a trustee of the foundation, he continues to be involved with its activities. He's written articles and books on various issues relating to the teachings of Krishnamurti. He's also delivered lectures on education, on science, and on society to various different audiences. He's an honorary scientist and fellow of the Indian National Science Academy in New Delhi, as well as the Indian Academy of Sciences in Bangalore. Before joining the Krishnamurti Foundation in India, he was professor of physics at the Department of Physics at Banaras Hindu University, where he'd been a faculty member for 24 years. His specialism is in solid-state physics, and his area of research and teaching being X-ray crystallography. So in closing this introduction, I want to welcome you all once more for joining us this afternoon and say a big thank you for being with us here today. The way the meeting will commence is that we'll mute your microphones and spotlight the speaker's video. At the end of the lecture, you may wish to ask questions, and you can do this by raising your hand using the participant option, or by vocally asking us to give you the word, or by writing your question on the chat box. So, Professor Krishna, thanks very much for being with us, and the word is now with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm grateful to Erica for inviting me to speak on this topic. I must confess that I'm not really a scholar on consciousness, so I'll be speaking to you more like a lay scientist or lay educated person, raising questions about both the religious view of consciousness and the scientific view of consciousness. Because consciousness is still largely a mystery. There are a lot of speculations about how it might have arisen or how it functions, but nothing is very definitely known. And as theosophists, we are essentially in quest of truth, which means it is important not to take sides with any view, so that the mind is open and to observe and inquire with a mind that is both scientific and religious at the same time, with a sense of wonder, a sense of mystery, and a curiosity to understand the truth. If we can approach it like that, perhaps deeper insights can arise which would expand our understanding of consciousness. So I'm going to raise several questions for which I myself don't have answers, definite answers. the main purpose being that we should ponder over them together. Now, all ancient religions, as well as religious sages down the ages, perhaps not all, but most, have maintained that there is a universal consciousness. Some of them call it universal intelligence, which maintains the order of nature. And what scientists study and describe as the order of nature and the laws governing that order is really a description of how that intelligence operates. So there is the concept of the evolution of consciousness right from the rocks and the minerals through the plant phase to animals and now to us human beings. Madame Blavatsky wrote that there is consciousness even in the rocks, but it's not visible to us because consciousness manifests itself to the extent the structure of an organism or an arrangement permits its manifestation. So it manifests through the human brain in us, but is not of the brain. That's what the religions are saying, that it operates all through our body and maintains the order of the body, which is a tremendous order. I mean, 1,000 things happen just the right way within our body. All that we do is eat some food and take some exercise. And everything else just runs automatically, occasionally going wrong, and then we become sick and we have to be treated till we come back to health. But order is health and disorder is sickness. With some variation, this view has been maintained almost in every religion. Some call it intelligence, some call it intelligent design, some call it consciousness. But the basic idea is that it is universal, it is not a product of matter, it's independent of matter and directs the matter and the development of the universe. Now, one of the questions that arises in this view is, if it is not a material thing, how does this consciousness interact with matter, including the matter in our brain or the brain of an animal or plant, whichever? How does it affect? According to science, it can only affect if it is also material and exerts a force and does work, which means it has to carry energy. But if it did carry energy, then the law of conservation of energy would break down, as known to scientists, because they don't take into account the energy that is imparted by consciousness. So it's questionable whether consciousness really carries energy or it is some kind of communication of information. Information can direct, but information doesn't in itself carry energy. So then the laws of physics and chemistry and biology are not contradicted. In quantum mechanics, you find a similar thing which scientists accept. There is a mathematical function given by Schrödinger called the wave function, which varies with time. And the system develops in accordance with this variation of the function. This function is just an imaginary function, mathematical function conjured up by Schrödinger. It has no real existence in nature. And yet it somehow informs the system. And the system behaves accordingly. Of course, one can't say that the wave function is the cause of that variation in the system, but it is a parallel development. And that's one of the mysteries of nature. That why does it have these laws, and why are those laws mathematical? Mathematics, a form of logic invented by the human mind, why does it apply in nature? Because a man like Einstein starts with some basic assumptions, as all science does, all theories do, then applies a lot of logic and mathematics, including experiments and observations and so on, and the known laws of nature, and predicts that light, when it goes close to a star, like the sun, must bend. And he calculates how much it must bend. And about 20 or 30 years later, when technology becomes sufficiently developed, sufficiently to do that experiment, they do it and they test and they find exactly it bends by the amount that he calculated. So not only the prediction is right, but the entire 100 pages of mathematics and calculus and so on, which Einstein did in order to arrive at that result, also applies in nature. That made long ago, much before Einstein's time in the 16th century itself, it made Galileo make the statement that God wrote the universe in the alphabet of mathematics. It's a great mystery. And many people feel that because we don't fully understand what quantum mechanics is, and we don't fully understand what consciousness is, it's possible that the two are related to each other. And when I talk about the scientific view, I'll tell a little bit more about what that connection is speculated to be. So that's one of the questions, that if consciousness doesn't carry energy, because energy in science is defined in very particular ways. It's the work, it's the ability to do work. When a force moves its point of application through a certain distance, the product of the force to the displacement is the work done. And the work done is the energy transferred. And energy by itself is neither created nor destroyed, but it can be transferred from one system to another. So if consciousness transfers energy to matter, then it must have energy to give to the matter. But there is no measure. That's one of the problems, that consciousness phenomena are not measurable. And the scientific method depends on measurement. Therefore, consciousness is right now beyond science, which sometimes makes scientists deny consciousness. But that is not rational, that's not logical. They use consciousness to do their science, to do their experiments. Only thing is, their science cannot tell what they are using. But because they can't tell with the existing knowledge of science, they cannot assert that therefore it does not exist. But there are scientists, die-hard scientists, who go to that extent, and then that becomes scientific belief, which is called scientism. Science has no belief. Science, the scientific spirit, is open-ended, open mind. Like we talk about the religious spirit in theosophy as having an open mind. Truth is the highest religion, we say. And similarly, the truth is posited always as the unknown. That is the scientific spirit. And you are exploring, doing experiments to determine what that truth is. You may have a certain speculation or an idea or a theory, but unless it is definitely established and can predict several observations, it is not taken as established. And therefore, the truth always remains as the unknown. Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel laureate from California, gave a definition of science, which is rather nice and true. He said, science is a body of knowledge, some of which is nearly certain, a lot of which is quite uncertain, and none of which is completely certain. That's the spirit of humility, that we don't know. We cannot assert that our knowledge today is the final knowledge, because so many times we have asserted that and then found that we were really very ignorant. So towards the end of the 19th century, people felt that almost everything had been understood about the universe and just some extra decimal place needs to be found. And after that, they discovered the entire theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, all of which was not known at that time. So that feeling was false. In the same way, today, the scientists have a theory of the origin of the universe and so on. And they were nearly feeling certain about it. But in the last 10 to 15 years, they have found experimentally that it explains only 5% of the matter visible in the universe. That there is 95% of matter and energy which are in the form of what they call dark matter and dark energy, about which they know nothing. So again, science is on the brink of a revolution, which may not come for quite a few years until they discover what is this dark matter. It's nearly 10 times more than the matter that is visible, because the matter that emits light and interacts with light. Dark matter does not interact with light, and so on. So the more we know, we expand the boundaries of that knowledge, but we also expand our understanding of the ignorance which is beyond that boundary. That's the nature of scientific development. And therefore, for them to assert, it's one thing to say that we don't know what consciousness is, but for them to assert that consciousness does not exist is simply a belief, and belief is anathema to science. So there are among scientists also those who are more broad-minded, like David Bohm and Roger Penrose and so on, who don't accept that. And there are right now many scientists who feel that the scientific concept of consciousness arising out of the aggregation of matter as an epiphenomenon, or as a result of the brain, the neurons in the brain, is inadequate, is not established. So it's really a mystery what consciousness is. Now, why do the scientists say that? The scientists say that because their dominant theory of the origin of the universe right now is that it began 13.8 billion years ago in a Big Bang. Nobody knows why that Big Bang occurred, but they have calculated from observations and so on, going backwards, knowing the laws of nature, applying mathematics. They have calculated that the Big Bang must have occurred 13.8 billion years ago. And at that time, the temperature of the universe must have been something like 10 to the power 60 degrees Kelvin, which means 10 and then 60 zeros following to that. An incredible, I mean, billions and billions of times larger than the temperature of the center of the sun. At that kind of temperature, atoms can't exist. Even nuclei cannot exist. Neutrons and protons don't exist. Only quarks and electrons and photons can exist. So their theory says that it was all a soup of these elementary particles in which this explosion took place. That's an assumption. And after that explosion took place, the universe has been expanding. It was pretty small at that time. It has been expanding till now, and 13.8 billion years have passed from that time. There's a fair amount of evidence they have gathered, otherwise they would not call it a theory. And they are able to explain many of the observations, but not all. As I said, we don't understand dark matter and dark energy. So there are always these aspects which are not clear in science, which need to be solved. But the basic theory seems to be fairly well established. Now that means that there was no life and no consciousness, because that soup of elementary particles had no structure. And so there wasn't any life, and therefore life and consciousness must be something that emerged later on in the development of the universe, which means it is an epiphenomenon, an emergent property, just as hydrogen and chlorine atoms can combine to form hydrochloric acid, which has different properties from hydrogen and chlorine. In the same way, aggregates of molecules and constituted solids and liquids with different properties. And eventually, we don't know how life came about. Now that's a big step, still unknown. How did the first living unicellular organism arise from completely dead chemicals and so on? Scientists have been trying to repeat that in the laboratory. They have succeeded in making amino acids, making proteins, making RNA and DNA, which replicate, but it's all dead. They don't have life. Science doesn't require life to exist. According to science, life is just an accident that took place. Otherwise, the universe completely developed, the entire development of the universe, the theory of the standard model of the development of the universe does not require life to exist or consciousness to exist. It's just completely a mechanical process. So that is one of the questions we need to ponder on about the scientific view. Can all this order that we see around us as trees and animals, as rivers and ecology and all that, and finally the human body and the order in the human body, could all this have resulted from that initial soup of completely randomly moving particles without any intelligence operating and directing the phenomenon? That's one of the questions. The scientists believe that it was all a mechanical process and it took a very long time, but eventually complexity arose and somehow this thing called life began. Now life, a living cell, is so fundamentally different from anything that is non-living that it is very difficult to accept that from non-living chemicals and so on, you can generate even an amoeba. No scientist has been able to do that and to generate an amoeba as yet. They are trying very hard, and the man who does will get a Nobel Prize for sure. So thousands and thousands of scientists are trying all the time in the laboratory. They have some idea that life must have originated at the bottom of the sea in certain caves, and first viruses formed and so on. There are theories of the origin of life, but it's not definitely known, and nobody is able to replicate it or do it in the laboratory and produce life out of non-living chemicals. So that is one big mystery for science. The other is the origin of consciousness. once the first unicellular organism formed, they have a reasonable theory of biological evolution started or given originally by Darwin, and it has been modified later on by some others, but the essential features remain the same. That there are genes inside the chromosomes of in the living cells, and those genes undergo mutations randomly, and those mutations cause species to have different growth. And those developments which are unable to survive, because the essential quality of life is that it's able to take food from the surrounding, convert it into energy, and use that energy for locomotion and reproduction and so on. That's something which non-living things cannot do. So according to them, all this happens through random mutations, no directionality in it. And so they consider that life was just an accident, and similarly that consciousness is also an emergent phenomenon. In fact, many scientists deny the existence of consciousness and consider that it's all brain activity, neurons. And so there are a number of questions which arise about this view. And of course, not all scientists accept this, including Roger Penrose, who has just got the Nobel Prize. He says you cannot generate awareness in a computer or in any mechanical, by any mechanical process. You cannot generate awareness, and particularly self-awareness, awareness of the inner feelings and so on. But this materialistic view of science has had very serious consequences in society. After Darwin's theory, people started feeling that it is part of nature that there must be competition and the survival of the fittest. And they started justifying that the poor people are poor because they are not intelligent, they are not fit for life, and therefore it's good that they can be eliminated. So a lot of cruelty resulted from that. Hitler really thought that Nazis were superior and Jews should be eliminated because these retarded people reproducing keeps the human race down. All that has been proved to be false, but that view came. And then if there is no purpose to life, it is just accidental, then what is the aim in life? Why should you be good? Why should you be kind? So a kind of inhuman element came into society from this scientific belief. And this divide between science and religion, which started at the time of Galileo, because some of his discoveries did not agree with the Christian church at that time, and the church persecuted him. From that time, there came a divide between science and religion. And that meant that scientific inquiry and self-knowledge and inquiry into morality also was eliminated in education. So our present-day education, which only cultivates knowledge and power and efficiency, but does not concern itself with wisdom or love or compassion, created a lopsided development of the human mind. So there is much that science needs to answer for. After all, it's the scientific knowledge which brought nuclear warfare into existence, brought all these weapons of mass destruction into existence. So though human beings have been at war for maybe 5,000 years, the wars were quite a different matter 1,000 years ago or even hundreds of years ago. War now means that it would be complete extinction. Einstein made a humorous statement of this. He said, I can't predict where the Third World War will start or how it will be fought, but I can predict how the Fourth World War will be fought. It will be fought again with bows and arrows. That means we will destroy all civilization that we have built. And we have brought the human race as well as all life on earth to this point of extinction, thinking that we are extremely intelligent and that all intelligence lies in the human mind. Whereas the religious people had said that there is universal intelligence in nature. And it is that intelligence which keeps the order in nature. And we need to respect that and follow that. We are part of that order. But we became arrogant. We started feeling that we were superior. Everything else was for our consumption. And the survival of the fittest and so on meant that power, getting more and more power and so on. So is there not intelligence in nature? Let's examine that. Consider a seed, something that happens every day. Seed falls to the ground. If it has no living cell in it, it just disintegrates, becomes part of the earth, follows the laws of physics and chemistry, becomes part of the earth. But if there is one living cell in it, it lies there in the soil for months together and senses when there is the right amount of moisture and sunlight and so on. A small twig comes out of that seed and it grows and grows and becomes a huge tree. And that tree can exist for 100 years or maybe even 1,000 years. Which means that that single cell, living cell in the seed had the power to change the entire kinematics of all the atoms in the soil and in the atmosphere and convert the solar energy into growth. Does all this happen mechanically? Doesn't require any intelligence? Do the laws determine that? Because in this second case also all the laws of physics and chemistry and biology are followed. So what determines which course will be taken? What triggers? Scientists give it the name genetics, but that's just a word. How does those genes, the arrangement of RNA and DNA molecules in the chromosome, direct all the phenomenon in this way for hundreds of years for it to happen? And all that without any intelligence? I have observed trees growing on a hill. Initially, they grow perpendicular to the sloping surface because they follow light. Then they bend. In order to survive, they bend. If they didn't bend, they went on developing like that, they would become too heavy, crack and fall because of gravity. So they sense the gravity and they adjust themselves. No intelligence. I watched the bougainvillea grow in our compound. It sends out shoots. It senses that there is a wire or a rope or a branch nearby, and it sends out shoots in that direction to receive support and builds around that. That's not intelligence. So we require intelligence in order to make a building. We require intelligence to make a computer. But the scientist says it takes no intelligence to make a lotus flower bloom from the mud. It all happens mechanically. I don't understand. Of course, I'm not a biologist. I don't understand. But I know one thing. In my research work in science, I was studying crystal growth. And there was the atomic theory of the growth of a perfect crystal from a supersaturated solution. In the supersaturated solution, the molecules are moving about randomly. They have to settle down on the surface of a crystal, form a layer, and then that layer has to expand and grow. That's how the crystal grows. So we calculated the probability of 100 molecules or 200 molecules coming and sitting together to form such a layer out of that random solution. Of course, given in a long enough time, everything is possible. The probability of that happening is very small, but given infinite length of time, it will happen sometime or the other. Sir James Jeans gave an interesting metaphor. He said, imagine 1,000 monkeys sitting at typewriters and typing randomly. What is the probability that they will type out all the sonnets of Shakespeare? He said the probability of all this structure in the universe arising from random motions is far less than the probability of those monkeys typing the sonnets of Shakespeare. This is in his book called The Mysterious Universe. He raised this question. That question is still there. And when we calculated the time it would take for a layer to grow, we found that to grow a crystal of 1 millimeter size, would take longer than the entire life of the universe, which means it contradicts. And in daily life, you can grow those crystals in a petri dish overnight. So that's known as the biggest gap between theory and experiment that has ever existed in science. So they had to find a mechanism by which the crystals grow. And that was part of the research that I was doing and so on. So the question is, out of random motion, it is true that you can get complexity. But how long will it take to get this complexity of a tree, of the human body, of an animal, and of a peacock with those beautiful colors and all that? So when scientists deny intelligence of nature, it looks more to me like a belief than a logical conclusion, unless they can prove that the time that it would take is less than the time for which the universe has existed. The argument fails on the face of it. There are other examples. According to them, it's all only the brain and the senses, which means the body. No consciousness. So the consequence of that is that there is only pleasure. There is no happiness. There is no joy, because joy belongs to consciousness, the spirit. So if joy doesn't exist and happiness doesn't exist, then the only purpose of life is to go on collecting more and more pleasures. And that's what you find. That society is all the time pursuing more and more pleasures, spoiling their health, getting addicted, and so on, because they have never asked themselves, is pleasure the same thing as happiness? Is joy the same as pleasure? Because you're denied consciousness. So I'm very skeptical about, though my training has been in science, I'm extremely skeptical about their assertion that consciousness doesn't exist and the mind is a myth. People like Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, Leadbeater, they have used consciousness to study. There's a whole book called Occult Chemistry, where they say we put the mineral in front of us and we make ourselves mentally smaller than the smallest particle in this material, and we are writing what we see. That book was written in 1908, even before Krishnamurti was discovered. At that time, they gave a table of all the atoms and their structure and so on as seen by them. The scientists laughed at them because they didn't agree with their findings. But eventually, with the advent of quantum mechanics and so on, they have come upon these triads and so on, which Annie Besant and Leadbeater have described in that book. The triads of quarks, which make protons and neutrons and so on. Apparently, they were, through consciousness, they were doing that research and discovering this. So there is a different way of investigating, which is not the scientific way of doing blind experiments and trial and error and so on. How did the rishis in India or elsewhere in olden days discover which plant will heal which disease? The entire Ayurvedic medicine developed in India without doing any of those experiments which scientists do. And now scientists are finding that many of those discoveries and medicines really heal and apply. Obviously, they used consciousness to find out which plant will cure which part of the body and which disease. So science is not the only method of investigating. We may have lost those powers of consciousness now, but doesn't mean that they don't exist. Even psychologists are studying telepathy and reincarnation and things like that, which are connected with consciousness, and finding that they exist. A scientist who denies an observed fact is not a scientist. Just because you can't explain an observed fact doesn't mean that the fact doesn't exist. The fact exists. So there may be nothing that is anti-science, because if you can prove that it is anti-science, it will go out of science. But there is a lot that is beyond science, and consciousness is something that is beyond science because it's not measurable. You can't measure how much joy you are experiencing or how much you love another person. You can't measure that. Doesn't mean that that doesn't exist. Scientists have a right to say that we have a domain called science in which we use this method which requires measurement. So science is about all measurable things, the truth about measurable things. But you cannot say that therefore there is nothing that is immeasurable in life. Our life consists of both the measurable part and the immeasurable. And that immeasurable is the domain of consciousness, which is studied by religion or through self-knowledge, which is connected with wisdom and so on. So I'll end it here. I have rambled as a layman about both the dominant view of the religious people and the dominant view of scientists, and raised a number of questions and doubts about both the views. It has no meaning to take sides. On what basis do you choose? If you say, I like this, what has truth to do with your liking? So as theosophists, one must keep an open mind, listen to both the views, and not align oneself with either of them. I think that's implied in theosophy when it says that truth is the highest religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Krishna, for such a wonderful lecture. We are opening now for questions. Because it's very late in India, we will have only 3 questions. All right, beginning with Tin. Tin, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Krishna, for a wonderful lecture, and I think you really hit the nail on the head with all the shortcomings of science. What I'd like to ask you briefly is, you mentioned dark matter and dark energy, which we hear a lot about these days, and a number of people in theosophical circles have speculated that this might somehow correspond to the finer states of matter that we talk about, such as the etheric states or even the astral or mental states. Do you think there could be any correspondence between dark matter and dark energy and these subtle realms which we talk about?
I don't know. It's all right to speculate, but it's not all right to take sides with a view unless you have definite evidence or a deep insight or perception of your own. Now, this insight and perception are things which happen through consciousness. Thought doesn't have insight, but because we have the capacity for awareness, we can go beyond knowledge and thought and pick up something which was not known before. That's how all major discoveries in science or religion or art have been made by people. So that capacity itself tells you that we have this thing called consciousness, or the awareness, which is the intrinsic property of consciousness. And that's what I quoted Roger Penrose, the latest Nobel laureate, who was the professor of Stephen Hawking. He's alive, he's still in Cambridge writing books. And he says that you can never make a computer which becomes aware of itself. The computer can calculate. It can calculate faster than we can calculate. It can play chess and defeat a human being. It can think, calculate, and so on, but it doesn't have the awareness that it is thinking. I not only think, but I am aware that I am thinking. So this quality of awareness is something other than thought. And while it operates through the neocortex in the brain, it's not the result of the brain. So Krishnamurti said, I don't know whether that is true or not, but he said from his perceptions that the mind is outside the brain. It's not in the brain. It is not coming from the brain. And that's what Roger Penrose is also implying when he's saying that you cannot generate awareness in a computer. You can make artificial intelligence, you can make predictions and so on. You can have much greater memory than what we can have. All that is being done. In fact, they are studying this and they are trying to make computers which can feel. And sometimes I feel that scientists are extremely stupid. They say, if you make a robot who will respond exactly as your wife responds, then there is no difference between the robot and your wife. But ask him whether he is willing to marry the robot. And he will not. Because it's not enough that the computer comes and says, I love you, without the heart beating and without the inner feeling of love. So I don't see how scientists can deny the existence of consciousness.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Thomas Martinovich, you have a message for you on the chat by Jay. Please read the chat if you can. Now, the next question, we will have 2 more questions only and close our session today. One is from Hasmukh, and one from Michael Hall. The question is, Professor Krishna, can we rule out the accidental creation of the universe as it goes against the principle of cause and effect? This question is from Hasmukh Shah.
Well, the way the scientists have responded to this is by saying that there are multiple universes. It is not just one accident that happened. We happen to be in a universe where life became possible. But there are other parallel universes in which are replicas of this universe, and so on. So they are trying to avoid that problem, but nobody knows this. I mean, this is all very speculative. So it's not really part of science.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, Michael, over to you, please.
Dr. Krishna, I think music is a higher revelation than science or religion. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on Dr. Penrose's view that consciousness manifests from the microtubules inside the brain cells in the form of sound or music.
Again, I think that is a speculation, and it may be a valid speculation, or it may not be. So unless there is definite evidence of that, it doesn't become part of definite knowledge. It remains as one of the theories that exist. Just as there are a lot of theories of how life originated, there are a lot of different theories in science about consciousness. In fact, I would recommend the lecture. A brilliant lecture was given by Eddie Billy Moria a few weeks ago in this same series on mystery of consciousness, where he described all the different developments, scientific developments, trying to explain consciousness. And I'm sure those of you who are interested and who didn't attend that talk can write to Erika, and she can send you the link to it, because it must have been recorded. And that would give you all the scientific theories, and he also pointed out the limitations of those theories. So yes, it is a speculation. They don't even know where memory is located in the brain. It's not located in any one region. And different memories seem to lie at different places in the brain cells. Now, there is this question, you see. It is true that if you introduce a certain chemical into the brain, it will simulate feelings of fear. And when you have feelings of fear, in the brain, that chemical is generated. So these, one produces the other. But that doesn't mean one causes the other. They are parallel things which are correlated with each other, but correlation is not the same as causation. So it doesn't prove that music in the brain can affect consciousness, but whether it can create consciousness, I doubt. It does affect consciousness. So many things affect consciousness.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the wonderful. I am posting a link to that Billy Moria lecture. If you would like to see the lecture that Professor Krishna mentioned, you can click on the link on the chat and see it. Professor Krishna, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. Tin, over to you. Would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you very much, Erica, and my thanks also to you, Professor, for a truly insightful look into this really difficult area. And I think you've done a fantastic job in elaborating the problems that both science and religion have in dealing with this. And I think it's a very interesting topic that has been chosen for the European School next year. But as with all good things, well, they must come to an end, and this is the end of today's meeting. So on behalf of the European School of Theosophy, I'd like to thank you all very much for participating. Just to remind you that our next talk, next Sunday afternoon, will be back to its normal time of 5 o'clock, and we can look forward to listening to Dr. Tim Rudberg, who will be speaking on the revolutionary idea of consciousness in H.P.B. Blavatsky's esoteric philosophy. And as I say, this is at the usual time of 5 p.m. London time. So I hope you'll be able to join us. And if you've enjoyed today, please tell all your friends about us, and they can always watch us live on YouTube if they can't participate. So thanks all again. And I wish you all a good week, insofar as we can have good weeks during these dreadful tyrannical times that we face. But I think as Theosophists, we have to do our best to make the best of what we've got. So thank you again, and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you. Bye.